So happy to have Professor Clark here with us. He's been a generous contributor to Carolina Public Humanities. He did a happy hour with us back when we did live events in a bar. Can you imagine? And he also, of course, took part in our GAA co-sponsored forum on systemic racism. We're absolutely honored to have our inaugural speaker be Professor Chris Clark presenting Black Political Power. Chris Clark, take it away.
Max, thank you so much for that very warm introduction. It's my honor to be here with you all. This is very different, and I guess it's not really unique for me to point out the circumstances, but I have to point them out. But it's a real honor to be here. I've been in North Carolina for about 9 years. I actually came here as a postdoc, and then I was hired on the tenure track, and I was promoted with tenure recently. And so it's just really nice to be here. 2 of my kids were born here. And so even though I haven't quite come around to saying y'all in the authentic way, I'm very much more that direction than I am otherwise. But at any rate, I'd like to talk with you all a bit here about Black political power, something that's near and dear to my heart. And I think it's also something that in this particular moment, many of us are really thinking about and wrestling with the implications of it, and maybe trying to make sense of how do Blacks actually wield political power. So I'm going to go ahead to my first slide with content. And as any person, I think any instructor sort of worth their salt. I want to begin by talking a little bit here about what do I mean by Black political power, right? And try to offer a definition, and in many ways explain to you what it is that I won't be talking about. All right, so I'm very aware of what Black political power may come off as meaning. Okay, thinking about sort of Black power and how that might actually sort of maybe confuse people, or maybe people have certain ideas in mind. Maybe the 1968 Mexico City Olympics and so forth. And so, in some ways, I think Black power from that perspective, or Black political power, I should say, from that perspective, has more to do with protests. So that first bullet point that I have, and so I think protests are critical. I don't think I could give a talk about Black political power without engaging with or talking about protests, especially thinking about the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement for African Americans and how that fundamentally shaped public policy in America more broadly. One thing I do want to highlight in this space is that research points to protests as shaping, among many things, public opinion. So in other words, there's established research out there that the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, okay, for Black people in the U.S., actually changed the way in which people thought about race and politics and civil rights more broadly. And I think that's a really important thing. So in other words, protests can make a difference. Protests can actually change how people think about things. Now, that'll probably be the extent to which I talk about protests, at least in some detail. So what I want to do now is actually talk more about voting power and also political representation. All right. And so when I'm talking about voting power, what I refer to in particular is voting power of the people. Okay. So you can think about voting that elected officials take part in and how they actually cast votes on particular policy matters. But when I'm talking about voting power of the people, I'm referring to the power of the ballot. Okay. People casting votes and letting their voice be heard in that particular way. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit here about the voting power of Black people in the U.S. And then I'm also going to spend a fair amount of time talking about political representation, something that I've thought a lot about and I've written about. And I'll explain to you the multifaceted way in which I think about representation, okay? And so I just want you to keep that in mind as well. The idea of elected officials, okay, and how they reach office, and then also maybe the ways in which they behave and advocate for the interests of Black people. Let me talk a little bit here about organizations. And so organizations play a critical role when it comes to understanding how Black political power is exercised in the United States. I'm not the first person to say this. Okay, in fact, way back in the 1980s, Haynes Walton, 1985, wrote a book, Black Political Behavior, where he talked about this. Okay, but what I want to highlight here is that when I think about churches, I think about historically Black colleges and universities, also known as HBCUs, NAACP chapters. These are just examples of organizations. So in other words, it's difficult to talk about Black political power without thinking about African Americans organizing themselves as a collective, not so much an individual Black person and how they try to change the system, but how Blacks come together, whether it be through churches or through accruing an education, or maybe or education, I should say colleges themselves, maybe lobbying government, or NAACP chapters advocating for change. And so I think it's critical for us to understand the critical role that organizations play when it comes to understanding Black political power. Also, I want to say something as well. Given that I'm an academic, I often can operate at a very abstract level. In some ways, I'm comfortable with that, but I'm also trying to make a concerted effort to make things as concrete as I can and to be accessible, okay? And I'll let you be the judge of how well I'm able to do that, of course. What I want you to think about, okay, is the idea that black political power, in general, okay, is greater. There's more of it. The lower the level of government, okay, the closer you are to the people, and then also the larger the black population. So in other words, local governments, okay, and especially municipalities where there's a large black population, that would be where I would expect blacks to be the most influential, and for black political power, I should say, to be the greatest, as opposed to the national level, sort of federal level offices in places where there are few African Americans, like a Vermont or a Montana or a Idaho, okay? So that's all to say, and let me just talk a little bit more here about the level of analysis here, or the level of government. The lower the level of government, the easier it is to actually enter into office here. The easier it is to exercise influence. The cost of entry is much lower at the lower level, at the local level, than it is at the national level, for example. Okay, and then the idea is when there's a greater population, you have more of an ability to vote. Okay, you can affect electoral outcomes much more. Politicians actually want to pay attention to black interests when there are larger black populations because of that very reason, okay? And so you have more ability for the voice of black people and for the interests of black people to be advocated for in places where there are, in fact, more African Americans. So let me move on to the next slide here. So how do black House members reach office? So many of you here from North Carolina could probably give a version of what I'm about to say here, although I hope to add a little bit more nuance to the current sort of understanding of how blacks actually reach office when it comes to the U.S. House, okay? So it turns out that black people that serve in the U.S. House of Representatives, okay, so made up of 435 members. Each state gets a certain number of districts based upon its population. They mostly come from majority-minority districts, okay? And in particular, districts that are majority black. This has long been the case, and so I'm pointing to David Lublin's work in 1997 as an example of research that points to that particular trend. It's important for you to understand why that's important. It's important because research also points to the fact that in general, okay, and on average, white voters are hesitant to vote for black candidates. Black voters are the strongest supporters of black candidates. And it's due in part to what I just said about the hesitancy for whites in general, okay, and on average, to vote for black candidates, okay? So as a result, the district composition, and in particular the racial composition of the district, is a key predictor of whether or not a black candidate is successful. It turns out that it's not as strong of a predictor as to whether or not a white person serves. A white person represents districts with a lot of black people or with very few black people, but the same can't be said in general for black people, all right? And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A if you'd like. Also, I want to highlight that there's a trade-off that exists between creating districts that lend themselves to electing black people, creating majority-minority districts, okay? And then also the extent to which you see more Democrats elected in office, which when I'm saying that to say, it points to the policy representation that black people receive in a given office. So allow me to unpack that a bit more. In other words, when you create that district that is majority black or majority non-white, which is the type of district that is best suited for electing a black House member, what ends up happening, especially in the South, and I'll get to that in a second, is that you end up gerrymandering. Now, I should just say that. I mean, it's a term that carries a lot of weight. You draw district lines in a way that concentrate black people in districts. And so by putting black people in a particular district, by packing them, I should say, in a particular district, it makes other districts in the state have less black people. And as a result, given how important blacks are, African Americans are, to Democrats getting elected in office, what you end up with is drawing districts that either favor black people who are Democrats or that favor white Republicans, all right? So that actually allows me to segue into this next point. And again, this all is coming from David Lublin's work. In the South in particular, which I think is relevant given this is Carolina, right? North Carolina, all right, Public Humanities. We're seeing fewer white Democrats serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. And in fact, you know, it's actually quite common for the only Democratic member of a House delegation from a particular state. The only Democratic member is also a black person. So that's true in Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi as of today. Okay, so North Carolina is a bit of an outlier in that respect because David Price is a white guy who's a Democrat, okay? But if you look around the South, you actually see many of the Democrats are usually black people, okay? There just are not as many white Democrats. And so that actually in some ways is a function of redistricting as well. I won't get into that right now, but I just want to, I'm happy to answer that in the Q&A. But the long and short of it is the redistricting that leads to black people serving in office. Well, actually, I'll unpack it now, okay? The redistricting that leads to black people serving in office, and it also helps white Republicans serve in office, tends to harm or decrease the number of white Democrats that serve in office. They end up being left out in this whole process in general. The other thing I want to say, and I'll get to this a little bit later when I talk about state legislatures, is that blacks are underrepresented in Congress, okay? You could think about representation, and you can think about the extent to which the presence of a group in a given entity reflects that group's population in the jurisdiction that that entity represents. That's all to say blacks are 13% of the U.S. population, according to recent census data, and yet blacks do not comprise 13% of House members. All right, and so that's something that I'll talk about a little bit later in terms of state legislatures, and it's something I think is critically important for us to understand in this moment where we're talking about systemic racism, and we're talking about the black experience, and we're talking about black political power, to recognize that blacks, compared to their population, are underrepresented in positions of power, and this is true in the U.S. House. All right, so allow me now, I'll transition to my next slide, and I'll talk, okay, what about black representation in state legislatures? And so this is something I've actually written a lot about. You know, as Max mentioned, I wrote a book on black representation in state legislatures through Gaining Voice, published by Oxford. And so I'll talk a little bit about my research in a second. But before doing so, allow me to kind of take a step back. I'll take a small step back here and help you kind of think about representation from a multifaceted perspective, okay? So I'm about to talk about representation in state legislatures in the same way that I talked about it in the U.S. House, which is from a district level perspective. So when we're talking about state legislative districts, first, it's important for us to recognize that there are a lot of blacks that serve in the state legislature, both in lower chambers and in upper chambers in states. And, you know, this is due in part to there being, okay, more seats available. So there are 435 members in the U.S. House. There are over 7,000 state legislators. And so there are more opportunities for blacks to get elected at the state level, and state legislative level, okay? Now, it also turns out that at the state legislative district level, black population is also a key predictor of whether or not a black person serves. So in the same way that a majority minority, a majority black district is best suited for whether or not a black person serves in the U.S. House, it's also the case that a district where a majority of the residents, state legislative district, where the majority of residents is black, okay, that also is the ideal scenario for selecting a black person in office. And so those trends are consistent across levels of government. So in other words, it points to the importance of racial demographics when it comes to understanding the extent to which a black person will actually serve in elected office. So I'm going to go to my next slide here. In the next few slides, we'll talk about research from my book, okay? And let's talk a little bit more on state legislatures. So now what I want to do is I want to pivot away from a conversation of representation at the legislative district level, okay? And think more about, think about representation from a different perspective. And so I want to talk about two different ways in which I want, well, at least in this slide, two ways, and then I'll talk about caucuses in a second. But one way we can think about representation is that's the overall seat share, the overall proportion of legislators that's black in a given space, okay? And so it turns out that the larger the black population in the state, the greater the overall number of blacks that serve in that legislature. So that's my way of saying states that have larger black populations also tend to be places where blacks hold a greater seat share in the legislature, okay? So if there are 100 seats, and let's say blacks make up, 25 of the members there, then they will comprise 25% of the legislature. So that's the seat share measure. And that's different from looking at whether or not a legislative district, 1 or 2 or 20, is represented by a black person, okay? That again points to the importance of racial demographics. Now something I was able to point to in my research that was new, that was different in terms of how we understand representation is what I'm about to say here about this representation ratio, or about the fairness of black representation, or about the extent to which blacks are underrepresented in state legislatures, okay? So it turns out that the places that have the largest black populations, okay, also tend to deviate more from parity than places that have maybe moderately sized black populations. So I want to talk a little bit more about that, okay? In other words, there's a curvilinear relationship, okay, that exists between the presence of blacks in the state legislature and how well the black presence in the legislature reflects the black population. So allow me to talk about this a little bit more. In the states like the Idahos and the Iowas that have very small black populations, okay, this black representation ratio, so the proportion black in the legislature divided by the proportion black in the population, tends to be quite low. And the way I think about it is there just aren't enough black people around to actually vote for black candidates, and let alone enough black people to actually run for office to get elected, okay? But as the black population increases, okay, that seat share that I just talked to you about, it approaches parity. It approaches 1. So let me talk about that a little bit more. Parity exists, okay, when the black population share reflects, or seat share, I should say, reflects a population share. So a state like North Carolina is about 22% black, and if black legislators in North Carolina made up 22% of the legislature, then we would have parity, okay? So it turns out that in the middle, we actually see the closest, it gets closest to parity, okay? But then in the Georgias and the Delawares and the Mississippis of the world, the Louisianas, these states that have black populations that exceed 25%, okay, that are on the high end. Mississippi will lead the way in terms of a black population of about 38%. They tend to move away from parity. So again, let me sort of give you the key point here, okay? The way in which I interpret this finding, okay, is that, first of all, just sort of as a takeaway point, I think about it as sort of the Goldilocks phenomenon, all right? So if the black population is too small, you don't have parity. And if it's too large, you don't have parity, but it's that sort of sweet spot in between where you get closest to parity. The other way I think about it is that the very places, right, with the large black populations where you would expect more black people to be elected, given what I've talked to you about in terms of the importance of demographics for how blacks reach office, I think about that as voter suppression, okay? I think about that as intentional efforts to pack blacks into fewer districts as a way to minimize their presence in the legislature, all right? And to me, that's a really important point, especially in this moment where we're talking about black political power. Again, for you North Carolinians that have lived through gerrymandering, right? It's almost like a fact of life. That is a potential implication of what we see of gerrymandering, which is the black seat share failing to be as close to parity as it might be otherwise, okay? So I'd like to go to my next slide here, talk to you about something that's a little bit more positive, you know, not voter suppression, okay, but more about how blacks can collectively organize themselves in legislatures and as a result, hopefully, be more influential in terms of advocating for black interests. So I want you to recall, okay, in the very beginning, I talked to you about the fact that organizations are key to understanding black political power. So caucuses, okay, or organizations that are created by black state legislators once they've actually reached office. And the way I want you to understand caucuses and their import is that caucuses matter when it comes to making laws, okay? If black legislators kind of have an agenda that they want to put forth, they can coordinate their lawmaking efforts, they can vote together on pieces of legislation, and as a result, act as a voting bloc and maybe get the types of changes that they want, right, out of the system, okay, through the lawmaking process. So they matter in that respect in terms of advocating for the interests of black people. Caucuses are also important because they provide emotional support for black legislators, a safe space to commiserate about what it means to be a black lawmaker. So what I want you to, I think an important point to understand about caucuses is that these organizations are likely to be created when you have a lot of blacks, when many blacks serve in the legislature, okay? So if you have a legislature where there are 4 or 5 black people, you're much less likely to have a caucus, you know, emerge than you would in a state where there are 10 or 15 black people. Is, I think, a helpful way to think about it. And so I think it's very important that we understand, all right, organizations not simply as existing outside of legislatures, okay, like the churches or the HBCUs or NAACP chapters, which are all important, obviously, but thinking about entities, organizations, I should say, that are created within legislatures that are meant to advance the interests of black people, and as a result, to be a potential source of black political power. So again, that's one of the chapters of my book where I talk more about that in case you're interested. So let's move on to the next slide here and talk to you a bit about policy representation for black people in state legislatures. And so in political science, interests can be talked about as racialized, okay? So education and welfare are considered black interests. I realize in a space like this that might be like, wait, why would you do that? I mean, white people are on welfare. White people, like, you know, they get educated. I recognize all that, and I would agree with you. The way in which the argument is made, however, is that when you look at the attitudes of the public, okay, at an aggregate level, so in general, you ask people about their attitudes toward welfare, okay, for example, what you see is more black people would want more welfare than white people. So in other words, support for welfare is greater among African Americans than it is among white Americans on average, okay? And in fact, and the same thing is shown too with education. Okay, so in other words, if you just look at sort of the attitudes that people have about these particular policies, you can make the case that among the people, among the masses, there is they view these programs as being more important or relevant to them. All right, so that's another thing I can really talk a lot about in Q&A. It opens up a whole nother can of worms in terms of how you define what's in the interest of a group, and I'm happy to talk more about that. Okay, so I want to talk about the findings for a moment. In my book, and this is chapter 4. So states with a greater proportion of black state legislators, so states with that higher, that increased black seat share that I talked to you about just a few moments ago, they tend to spend more per pupil, okay, on pre-K through 12th grade education. And so that's something that I think a lot of us are thinking about now in terms of how much are we funding public schools, especially in this moment, all right, of COVID and so forth. But that's all to say that in my research, what I show is that in the states where you have more black people, you actually see more money devoted to public education. And I think that's a really important finding, okay? Especially if you think about what I said about education as being like in the interest of blacks. What this finding points to is that when you have more black people in the legislature, you actually can get better representation of black interests, at least when it comes to this issue of education. And education for pre-K through 12th grade, okay? The other thing I want to highlight, and this is more in the vein of the voter suppression piece, okay? And in fact, the way in which I think about this in my research is the idea of the double-edged sword, of black political power, all right, given the nature of this talk that I'm giving today. So states that have a greater proportion of black state legislators and where the majority of lawmakers are Democrats, okay, the Democratic Party, so big D, monthly TANF cash benefits are less generous. So my goodness, I just packed a lot into that point. So let me take a step back here. What do I mean by this? So welfare, all right, being something that many people experience, all right, and in particular, all right, and you think about it as sort of a social safety net, right? And again, I'm lecturing you all on welfare. So welfare, all right, we kind of know what it is, most of us, okay? But allow me to talk a little bit more about TANF and why it's relevant. So bear with me, please. The reason why I like examining the TANF cash benefit is because it's something that we all understand, all right? We all kind of can make sense of. So here, let me give you an example here. I'm by no means affluent, all right, but I have some cash money here. It's been hard to spend recently. You can't really, everyone wants debit cards, right? But I still have my money. I think I've had this since March, believe it or not. I haven't had a chance to spend it. But we all understand the value of $1, okay? And so when I talk to you about the monthly TANF cash benefits that the government gives to a family, and in particular to a family of 3, so keep in mind, these are individuals who need this money in order to subsist, okay? Temporary assistance for needy families, a welfare program. It turns out that the very scenario where we would expect black political power to be greatest, because we have a large number of black legislators, and because the party that has the majority of seats is the Democratic Party, allow me to make this clear, the party that many black state legislators identify with, the party that ostensibly is the party that would support more money to be spent on welfare. It's in that very scenario where we actually see less generous cash benefits. I'm gonna take this another step. So in other words, if you have a large number of black state legislators, okay, and you have a state where a majority of lawmakers are Democrats, you will be expected to spend less money on TANF to provide people who are impoverished with less cash money, okay, than a state that also is majority Democratic in terms of its lawmakers, but that has fewer black faces. Let me give you a specific example. You can think about Illinois, which has a fair number of black state legislators, mostly due to Chicago, if I'll be honest with you. And anyone that knows anything about the demographics of Chicago will be nodding with me, okay? Or of Illinois, I should say, would be nodding with me. And you compare that to a northeastern state, okay? Let's say a Rhode Island or some other place like that, okay? Because I don't want to keep picking on Vermont here, but maybe I should pick on Vermont. But a state that has far fewer black state legislators, my findings would suggest that the people in Illinois who are on TANF would actually receive less money, and that could be attributed to the fact that there are more black state lawmakers in that particular setting. So here's the takeaway point, okay? On the one hand, having more black faces in state government leads to more money being spent on public education, but on the other hand, it actually can lead to less money being spent on TANF. And that's that whole double-edged sword idea that I was talking about. And it's something I was really struck by these findings, as I took part in this research, because my expectation, folks, to be honest with you, is that the arrow, it would be I would find the opposite. I would find that in a scenario where you have a lot of Democrats and a lot of black people, that's sort of the perfect storm for improve, right? For advocating for black policy interests. And that's not what I find. So let's talk here about leadership for a moment. So I'll move to the next slide. So black leadership positions in state legislatures. That's actually the paper that Max mentioned in the introduction. I had the privilege of writing with Eric Hansen. It was just published this year. And the reason why I think this is an important topic is because it's one thing to be a rank and file legislator, okay? But it's another thing to hold a leadership position. And the way I think about leadership is that leaders both have like influence or sway over particular things within their domain as a leader, okay? But then there's also this symbolic importance of leadership, okay? And so when you see a black person hold a leadership position in the state legislature, especially in light of the experience of black people in this country, all right, that sends a message, right? That, hey, like this group actually can serve and can wield power. And so above and beyond what that black leader might do with that position, it has this symbolic importance associated with that. That person is symbolically important as well. So I'd like to highlight two things, all right, that Eric and I, Hansen and Clark 2020, what we find in our paper. And the first is when legislative leaders are elected, you have fewer blacks that serve in leadership positions, okay? This points to the importance of selection methods, of the rules of the game, and how those things can impact how much power black people wield in a legislature. So I'll say a little bit more about this. The way in which Eric and I think about this particular finding is as follows. When you allow all of the legislative chamber to cast a vote, okay, to vote on, to elect who serves as a leader, it actually suppresses, it decreases the number of black people, of black faces in leadership. But when you leave it up to a subset of leaders to determine who the other leaders will be, you actually get more diversity in terms of black people. This, in many ways, folks, is an extension of what I said to you about majority-minority districts and about the overall racial composition of the state being important for black seat share. In other words, there are certain things, and the first two have to do with demographics, and this has more to do with rules. So that is a slight difference. But the point of the matter is, there are some scenarios that better lend themselves to black people gaining political power. All right, and so when you allow leaders to be elected, that doesn't bode well for how much political power black people have. And I think that's an important topic for people to understand. I'll say this, one more thing. It's important for us to understand this, I think, folks, because a lot of times in research on representation, we focus on how do people reach office, all right? How do blacks get a seat at the table? How do blacks gain voice, okay? And then a lot of research looks at this question of how much does having black people in government impact the policy representation of black people. So what I talked to you a bit about welfare. But as I looked at the literature, there's far less information about, okay, once you have black people in the legislature, okay, or is there any sort of systematic trend we can uncover about how they're able to access power? All right, so anyone, whether you're in an academic setting or whether you're in a business setting, you know the difference between leaders and those who aren't leaders. And so I think it's a critically important question to understand, how do blacks become leaders? Okay, so the other thing that I suppose is good news is that when there are more black people, you see more black leaders, okay? And in some ways, I think that makes, in my mind, that makes sense, okay? Because if you only have a couple of black people, then it'll be hard to have a lot of black leaders. But when you have a pool of black legislators from which to draw, you actually see more black people serve in leadership, okay? And so the one way you can think about that is, what's one solution to having more black leaders? Get more black people to serve in the legislature, okay? And so that's a more positive way of thinking about, okay, what can I change? What can I do to maybe increase the number of black faces in leadership? So I want to pivot here to voter turnout. And oh, goodness. I teach classes, like literally, like I could talk hours about this. I won't do this. You all didn't sign up for that long. And I know Paul and Max have other things to do. I also have, I have to eat dinner at some point, right? But this is, oh goodness, this is 2020. Let me just be real, right? We are in this moment. We're in the middle of August in an election year, okay? John Lewis, the conscience of Congress, he who marched in Selma, okay, just passed away. And so that's all to say, first bullet point, since the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, blacks throughout the country have been a pivotal voting bloc, okay? The way I want you to understand this is black people could vote before 1965, but in particular in the South, there were rules on the books that made it difficult for black people to vote. But once the Voting Rights Act was passed, it made it far easier for blacks to gain access to the franchise, okay? And then my mention of Lewis, I think, is relevant in the sense that Literally, blood was spilled in order for black people to have the right to vote. Okay. So sub bullet point here, I want to talk a little bit here about the fact that I want you to keep in mind, okay, to recall that when you have more black people in a population, blacks wield greater voting power. Okay, it goes back to that majority-minority district idea. So if you would ask yourself, okay, where are the places where I might expect blacks to have the greatest voting power? Where might I expect black voter turnout to matter most? Well, it's going to matter most in places where there are a lot of black people, okay? And so I'm just trying to connect some dots here for us in terms of understanding the import of black voter turnout. And I'll talk more about black voter turnout in presidential elections in a second. Let me just talk here briefly. I have a paper I published and shows that being contacted is really important for blacks who don't vote frequently, okay? I use the language here of infrequent or disengaged. They both point at the same idea. So that's another way of saying, like, having someone actually reach out to you and provide you with information about the act of voting, okay, or about a candidate. It's really important for blacks who are on the fringes, for blacks who don't vote frequently, who aren't necessarily tuned in, plugged in to the political process. And I think that's an important thing, especially in an election year where we're thinking about, voter mobilization and so on and so forth. My research will point to contact, okay, by organizations in particular, okay, as being key to mobilizing black voters. Now, this is, hopefully you all are seeing here, I'm honest, folks, when I talk, and this is exactly how I try to be like this way in the classroom. I let my students sort of speak to how well I do this. But, the way in which I think about research and think about teaching is to point to you both those things that are good and those things that are less good or ugly, right, or bad or what have you, and to give you both perspectives, right? Instead of pretending that the ugly doesn't exist or that only the good exists, give you both, okay, and you do with it what you will. So I'll talk to you a bit here about the Voting Rights Act, okay, and being contacted is being key to increasing black voter mobilization. I would be remiss to have a conversation about black political power, especially in the state of North Carolina, and not talk to you about strict voter ID laws and felony disenfranchisement laws as having the opposite effect. And so here in the slide, I mentioned it limits black voting power because I try to be mindful of my language and what it might mean. Another word you could use in lieu of limit would be suppress, okay? And again, I don't have the time in just this 1 hour lecture to get into all of this, but there is research that points to these things as being true, okay? That blacks are affected more by these strict voter ID laws, and they also are disproportionately affected by these felony disenfranchisement laws. And so the latter you all might not know as much about. I think the voter ID laws have been in the news in the last 7 years at least, okay, in North Carolina. And so if you have questions about that, I'm happy to talk with you about it. But these felony disenfranchisement laws also disproportionately affect black people. I mean, there's numbers that show as many as 1 in 7 black men at some point may not be able to vote because of being a convicted felon. And I'll say this too while we're in this setting. It also is a case that these laws are tied to racial politics. Okay, there's research that actually points to like the racial makeup of an area being linked to the implementation of these laws. It's all to say it disproportionately harms black people. Okay, and race. It's hard to talk about felony disenfranchisement laws without talking about race, and in particular, without talking about black people in the U.S. Let's talk about black voting power. On to my next slide, and partisan change in the South. And so, actually, I'm teaching a class on Southern politics, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, and especially now that I've lived here in the South, and I enjoy it. I mean, I enjoy all the classes I teach in Southern politics. So I always have so much material from which to draw people. I end up leaving so much on the cutting room floor because there's just so much that goes on. But Hood, Ken, and Morris in 2012 wrote a book called The Rational Southerner, where they seek to explain why the South became a Republican stronghold. There are lots of explanations out there. Some people say civil rights. Some say the economy shifted. Some say folks from other parts of the country moved to the South and changed the partisan makeup of the region. But what these authors point to is black voting power, the ability of black people to cast a vote, as being a key explanatory variable. Now here I am talking shop. In other words, a key explanation, a key factor that shifted. Okay, going back to the Voting Rights Act, the passage of the Voting Rights Act, empowering all these black people in the American South to cast votes, okay, actually contributed to the South becoming more Republican. Okay, so allow me just to say, I'll say this next bullet point. I'll add just a little bit more here so that I don't leave you, so that you have a clear understanding of what's going on. Okay, so in reality, folks, what their argument explains is why many white people left the Democratic Party. Okay, and in fact, look, I think I actually kind of summarized the argument well. You had Southern blacks increase their voting power. They wound up joining the Democratic Party. They wound up changing the policy platform of the Democratic Party. Okay, the very complexion. I don't know if that's a pun I should make or not, right? But the very makeup of the Democratic Party changed once blacks gained political power, voting power. And as a result, that led to the more moderate conservative whites, those who weren't happy with those changes, is leaving the Democratic Party, okay? And for many, finding a home in the Republican Party. So that's all to say, you may not have thought about it this way, and it wasn't actually until I read their book, and I signed their book in my class on Southern politics, that one explanation for why the South became Republican had to do with black political power. And so I think that's worth sharing in this particular setting. So I'm going to go on to the next slide here, and then I only have two more, including this one. So black voting power in presidential elections. So the mobilization of black voters was key to both of Obama's victories. You might be thinking to yourself, really, Dr. Christopher Clark, like I lived through this. I'm paying money for you to tell me this? Well, I'm going to add a little bit more here, people, okay? But it was critical, all right? Blacks voted for Obama at an extremely high rate, okay? It was a really close margin here in North Carolina in 2008, okay? For those of you who were here, you know that. And so it's important that we understand that Obama bringing in black voters was a big part of why he was able to become the first black president in the U.S., okay? Next bullet point here. Some point to the lack of black voter mobilization is why then Secretary Clinton failed to win her bid for the White House in 2016. And now here's the thing. There are lots of different explanations out there. I think people are still wrestling with them. So I don't want to dismiss that outright, okay? But just allow me to say this, which is, yes, blacks didn't turn out at the same rate as they did for Obama, okay, in 2008 and 2012. But things were also more complicated. Shelby v. Holder, which I didn't even put on slides here, but I'll just mention in this space, it gutted the Voting Rights Act. And so it turns out that states had the ability to implement voting laws that were more restrictive between 2012 and 2016. And even though I haven't crunched the numbers yet, right, in my mind, and given what I know about black politics and elections more broadly, I can't help but think that contributed, okay, or at least partially explains why fewer blacks turn out to vote. So, anyway, I can come back to that in the Q&A. This is a topic I've thought a lot about and very passionate about, but I want to at least say in this space that I think it's more complicated than just black people not wanting to vote. Although, in the broader point I want to make in this slide, I think people are right to say that blacks are really important as a voting bloc, and blacks not turning out at the same rate, okay, actually helps us understand why Clinton didn't win. So I'm trying to do two things here. Both recognize that reality and then also push back a little bit in terms of it being a little bit more complicated. All right. So black voters are also key to Vice President Biden, okay, winning the Democratic presidential primary in 2020. All right. South Carolina. That's all I have to. I guess, am I allowed to say that? I know this is the North. It says Carolina Public Humanities. I assume that includes our state to the south. But in all seriousness, okay, I don't think you need a PhD in political science to make this conclusion, okay? Black voters helped Biden win, and that fundamentally shifted the Democratic primary, okay? And so that's all to say. Black people really matter, and they really matter in terms of any election. Even though I made the case that black voters matter more the lower the level of government, the case can be made, given the size of the black population and how important that is as a measure of black voting power, that in the South, when it comes to Democratic presidential elections, you have to win over black voters if you want any shot at all at getting the nomination. And I think that's borne out. That's been borne out the last number of election cycles, okay? Actually, this last point I want to make on this slide before I move on to the future of black political power is that, in the end, while black voters will continue to be important, keep in mind that the group only makes up 13% of the U.S. population. So this is my way of, this actually fits in with my second point about Secretary Clinton losing in 2016. And even though this is a talk on black political power, everyone, I'm also talk a little bit here about other groups, okay? So just bear with me. So blacks make up 13% of the U.S. population, whites over 60%, okay? So another way we could think about what happened in 2016 is that over 80% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, and over 50% of white women voted for Donald Trump. So I know I just dropped that in there, didn't I? See, it's almost like I dropped the boulder, but that's all to say this, people, okay? Black people matter, all right? I just talked for a long time, and obviously I study this. I care a lot about it. And black voters will continue to be important, okay? But other racial groups will also be important as well. That's what I'm trying to achieve here. So let's bring it home here, the future of black political power. So I expect blacks to continue to wield considerable political power, okay? So closing thoughts here, last slide. I expect blacks to continue to wield considerable political power in the U.S., okay, especially in the Democratic Party. However, as demographics continue to shift in this country, all right, Latinx, Latino individuals are about 18% of the U.S. population, okay, so a number of years ago surpassed blacks as like the largest non-white group, minority group. Asian Americans, their population is increasing. That's all to say our country is moving towards a majority minority country. Some people say early 2040, 2042 will make that change. There are some states like California that are already majority minority. And the reason why these states are like that has more to do with like the Latino population than it does actually the black population in some cases, okay? That's all to say, people, that black political power will continue to be relevant. I think it's something people will continue to have to pay attention to and wrestle with. And this is especially true in the Democratic Party and especially true in our region of the country, the American South, which happens to be where most black people live, okay? In other words, states that have large black populations are concentrated in the American South. I'll put it to you that way. But other groups are also important as well, okay? So I could see someone, and in fact, we should have talks where we wrestle with the political power of Latinx, Latino individuals, okay, and the increasing political power of Asian Americans, all right? And maybe CPH will put on talks like that in the near future. Who knows? But that's where our country's going. What I will say as well, this is a final thought here, is expect a mixture of cooperation and competition between blacks and other racial and ethnic minorities. So McLean and Johnson Carew have a really great book that I actually use in one of my courses. And so the way I want you to understand this is that minority groups have a shared experience of discrimination. This whole idea of the BIPOC, right? Black, indigenous, people of color. So kind of have this shared experience of what it means to live in a world, in a country as people who are non-white, okay? And that's true. And that might encourage these groups to work together, all right, to change the system in a way that will benefit them. But on the other hand, what we have to keep in mind is that there's another side to this, which is that there's also competition over jobs, competition over who's going to serve an elected office between blacks and other minority groups. And so we should recognize both of these things as potentially playing out here as we look to the future of black political power. So not just everyone holding hands and getting along, singing Kumbaya and getting along and so forth, but there may be being some tension as well. I live in Durham, North Carolina, and it's sort of a great example of seeing how that plays out as there's been an increased Latinx, Latino population there, and thinking about some of the consequences of that, in a city that where blacks have long wielded political power. So that's what I have. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, because you can hear the deafening roar of applause right now. I'm sure we have to wait a minute for the applause to die down. We thank you so much. That was incredibly informative and really thorough. Thank you for that great analysis. I would like to invite our participants now to use the question button at the bottom here. And I do have one question to start, and that is from our distinguished director, Lloyd Kramer, who asks, what do you think would be the best strategy to enhance black political influence? And gerrymandering, focus on making voting easier and more accessible, or recruiting more black candidates to run for office? Thank you for that question, Lloyd. Chris?
Well, no, thanks, Lloyd, and yeah, thanks for that question. If I had to pick one, if I had to choose, Lloyd, anyone else that has that similar question, I think the middle category. I think the idea of making voting easier, making voting more accessible, to me is like the most important change, okay? Because the thing with gerrymandering is it's always going to take place, right? What ends up happening is you have, in general, a party that's in power, and when they're in power, they don't want to change how district lines are drawn, okay? But when they find themselves in the minority party, all of a sudden, they tend to want to support, changes to how lines are drawn. So again, not everyone is like this, but generally speaking, you see that play out. But in my mind, all right, once we move beyond, gerrymandering is just sort of something tough to get around, okay? In terms of recruiting candidates, I think that is critically important, okay? But it's also the case that you can recruit a black candidate, but will that candidate actually win? And given what I said about the importance of racial demographics and how these things influence how successful black candidates are, I'm hesitant to say, hey, let's recruit a lot of black people to run in these states with really small black populations, or in states where people may have more hostile attitudes towards African Americans, because then the person won't actually be successful. But I think if you empower black voters, if you actually extend early voting, if you actually have election day registration, if you allow for automatic voter registration, if you actually implement these changes to how elections are administered, if you get rid of these felony disenfranchisement laws where if you owe someone alimony or that you actually can't vote. Again, I know I just dropped something really specific there, but there's so many intricacies when it comes to voting. Okay, and that point I made about the 1 in 7 black men being unable to vote because of being a convicted felon. So if you think about like the war on drugs, right? Again, I brought that in the Q&A, didn't I? Talk about sneaking that in, folks. That's all to say that if we made voting more accessible, all right, maybe an election holiday, right? All those kind of reforms that are out there, I think that would be the way to really empower black people.
Great. Thank you, Chris. We're waiting. We've noticed that when we do online programs, people get a little bashful to put their questions down right away because they're suddenly in print. But I have some questions for you. Oh, look, do we have another question? Yes, we do. We have a question here from, I don't have a name, but is there any predictive data on excitement for Biden in the black population?
Oh, I like that. So I don't, that's such a good question. So I'm thinking here. I read something on 538 a while back about black support for like establishment candidates, okay? And so that doesn't quite directly answer the question. So let me just be honest. I don't know offhand, like I haven't read a poll that says, how excited black people are about Biden. I'm sure that sort of data is out there, okay? What I will say about Vice President Biden, all right, which I think is important, is, and I'm really struck by this, is he was the first black president's vice president, and he just picked the first black person to be a vice presidential candidate. Okay, so Joe Biden has played this really important role in terms of making history when it comes to black presidential politics, and I definitely believe, and I definitely get the sense that choosing Kamala Harris, choosing Senator Harris as his running mate, all right, this black woman, also South Asian, but this woman of color as his running mate, this woman of color who is rare in that she was elected to the U.S. Senate. Okay, Carol Moseley Brown in 1992. Was a black woman elected to the U.S. Senate. Okay, and as far as I know, it wasn't until Senator Harris was elected that there was another black woman in that particular office. I think that excites black people. And if you think about the importance of black women as voters, due in part to these felony disenfranchisement laws really disproportionately affecting black men, that's all to say that I get the sense that in general, women of color, black women are excited to have Kamala Harris, having Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as a ticket. And be honest with you too, whoever anonymous person there, I get the sense, and again, some of this is my own experience, some of this is from reading things, that for many black people, well, here I'll tie it to you this way. For many black people, they're pragmatic when they vote, all right, and so President Trump's administration has been harmful to black people. Many of President Trump's policies and actions have undid what. Or meant to undo what President Obama put in place. Okay, I don't have the time to list everything here, but just think climate change, for example, is one example. That's all to say. I think for many black voters, they saw Joe Biden as the person best positioned to defeat President Trump, and so I think that excites them. Maybe not the same way they were excited about Obama, for example.
So I'd like to build on that question, if you'll indulge me, Chris. One of the things that, Joe Biden sometimes has gaffes, as we know, and he says, but you would mention something really important about policy positions when you're talking about welfare. And how can white politicians be better about policy issues so we don't have a situation where Joe Biden just sort of has this gaffe where he equates poor children with black children? And how are when white politicians talk about these issues, how can they do better to be received in the black community, if you will?
No, that's a great question, Max. And I think what I would say is one of the things I'm struck by, and if I was just writing something about this actually before today's conversation, so I was just thinking about this, is that for many black people there's this deficit of trust, there's this lack of trust with the political system more broadly, but then also with white politicians. And so white politicians actually have to kind of go above and beyond to prove themselves as being actually loyal to the black community and somehow in advancing the interests of the black community. And so on the one hand, I think they have to do more work to in order to prove themselves as loyal. But on the other hand, Max, one of the things I've been struck by is the willingness of black people as a whole. And again, I always want to be very careful that I'm speaking generally here. I'm not speaking for all black people, but to be able to forgive people, to be able to move past things people have done that are harmful. So a great example here is thinking about what happened in Charleston, in 2015 with Dylan Roof, and how not too long after that, you had black people there saying that they forgave him, right? And again, I don't have space to really unpack that, folks, but and I think I'm just amazed at that, in terms of black people as a whole, the willingness to to forgive people for gaffes, right? I mean, Biden said something about Obama, I think being articulate or eloquent or something back in 2008, right? I mean, so in some ways, black people are accustomed to it, and so are willing to kind of look past that. So I keep doing this thing with the duality, don't I? But that's kind of where I land in terms of this two-sided nature of how blacks kind of engage with white politicians.
You're a perfect humanist. This is what we want. So we have a question. We have definitely getting questions in. This is great to see questions coming up. So there's a question from Don Anderson. Thank you for this talk. What collaborative and justice-building work do you see between Southern black politicians and Southern Jews? As well, what collaboration do you see between Southern black politicians and Southern Muslims? And then a note, I attended the AJC meeting today, and the remarks from the politicians were interesting. Thank you for that question, Don.
Yeah, Don, I wish I could give you a great answer. So again, I'm an academic, so I'm going to offer you the best I can, right? So I don't know as much about those sort of on-the-ground collaborations, okay? What I can speak to, though, is, historically, right, there being this alliance that exists between black people and Jews, right? And Jewish individuals being really key players in the civil rights movement, right? So again, Don, you probably already know that, so I don't know if I'm telling you anything new. And in terms of Muslims, one of the things I'm struck by, and again, I don't know of specific efforts of people to collaborate, although I'm certain that there are such instances out there, is, so many Muslims are in fact black, okay? I think about Keith Ellison, for example, who's received some attention here recently in Minnesota, and so in my mind, there's actually sort of a natural overlap in interest between blacks and black Muslims and Southern blacks. But again, I don't know specific examples, but I'm certain, especially in this era that we find ourselves in, because I was really careful with my answer there, Don, and others at home. Blacks aren't the only group that have reason to want President Trump to no longer be in office. Okay, many other groups also feel like President Trump doesn't best represent their interests, and I would include Muslims for sure in that group. All right. And I would also think, Jewish individuals, given their political leanings, those who are more liberal, given their political leanings.
Okay, great. We have a question here from Sam Jackson. Hello, Sam. It's nice to have a friend on with us. What impact does a candidate like Tim Scott, Republican senator from the other Carolina, have on black politics and black political power?
Oh, thank you for this question. I'm going to give. I'm actually talking about Tim Scott in my Southern politics class. I'm teaching asynchronously, I love that question. I love that question. Okay, so I'm going to be honest with you here. You said it was Sam Jackson. I love that question, Sam, because what I like about Senator Tim Scott is that he causes me to rethink my arguments in the way in which I approach black politics. Okay, my study of black politics. So many black politicians are Democrats that in many ways I could just kind of get away with talking about black interests and black people in this monolithic way. But I know, because of Tim Scott, all right, Alan West, I know, Mia Love, that there are black Republicans. And here's what I'm fascinated by with Tim Scott. Tim Scott received very little support among black voters in South Carolina. I think maybe 10% voted for him in his most recent election. Don't quote me on that, Sam, but a very low proportion. But a lot of white voters voted for him. And so what I think Tim Scott represents, and plus, he's a really charismatic guy. He has this incredible story. He's a person of faith, right? He talks a lot about his faith. He, because of his partisan leanings and because of his values, fits perfectly for South Carolina. And so it's a great example of how, as much as racial politics matters, in some ways ideology, right, partisanship maybe matters even more. And I think Tim Scott is a really great example of that. Now, what I will say, Sam, and other people at home, I don't know how many more Tim Scotts are out there. Will Hurd, I was trying to think of the brother's name that was in Texas. I think he chose not to run again. I have to double check, but he was a black Republican in this district in Texas, right? I could almost name black Republicans on a couple of hands here, right, in recent years in Congress. And so that's all to say. Tim Scott very much makes me rethink my own arguments, but also I don't know how many more Tim Scotts there are out there. But I love the question, and I think he's really a super interesting guy in terms of from an academic perspective and just from a real world perspective.
Thank you for that question, Sam. And we have a question from Charlie. How do you think the Black Lives Matter racial justice movement, which includes a large number of non-black individuals, might impact the election?
No, a great question. My sense is that they'll matter a lot, right? And it's interesting. I mean, obviously, people have different views about the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Some are in favor of it, some are skeptical of it or fearful of it. But one thing I think, especially, and thanks for the question, Charlie, is I think people will vote, right? I think that, and I think that in my mind, like protests are so critical, right? And let me just be honest with you two here. I'm not like an expert on protests. I'm more of a representation scholar, so I know much more about that. But protests matter, right? And they matter in terms of shaping how people think about things, but they also matter in terms of impacting policy as well, and also getting people out to vote. And so I definitely think the Black Lives Matter movement is going to be key in terms of mobilizing voters, all right, and getting people to express their preferences in that particular way.
Because we had talked, as you know, we had Jonathan Weiler on the radio show this Monday, and we talked about Black Power. And I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of soft, informal Black Power, Black celebrity in sports and in popular culture. What kind of effect can that have on formal politics? And I say that only because, depressingly, politics is becoming so much more about celebrity. We look at the Kanye West situation here. So could you speak a little bit to sort of informal and soft Black Power and the influence of Black celebrity in athletics and in other forms of entertainment?
Oh yeah, thank you, man. That's a great question. So much to say. What I will, I think it matters a lot. If we were in person, I would show my students in my Southern Politics class a video of 1960 political ads, and so that was Kennedy against Nixon. And there's an ad where Kennedy actually is talking with Harry Belafonte. Now, you all who are older, y'all might know him. He's a smooth brother, man. I mean, a Black celebrity. And so it's actually Kennedy, I think that was his way to signal to the Black community that, hey, like, he cares about civil rights, and they're having this conversation, okay? And so I'm going all the way back 60 years just to make this point that I think as we fast forward into today, I mean, Kanye West is a very interesting, guy. I don't know if I had the time to unpack all what's going on with him, Max, but I think about LeBron James, right, and Patrick Mahomes, and these other athletes that are just being more vocal, especially LeBron, right, and his sort of brand, being more vocal about politics and where they stand. And so I think, especially for younger people and for people who are fans of them, that actually makes a big difference. I mean, I think for some people who already are going to vote and who are already engaged, it may not mean as much. But I think for younger people who aren't, if you look on average, as engaged, it goes a long way. I'll also, I don't know how much time do I have here.
We got plenty.
Okay, I'll also talk about the NFL. Oh my goodness. I mean, and maybe I'll come back to Kanye then. Just remind me. The NFL, I'm also struck by. I mean, I look at what's going on and the fact that Mahomes, is a Black quarterback, has aligned himself with LeBron. This idea of trying to get people out to vote. I'm thinking about the Kaepernick and the whole kneeling situation, and obviously that's very polarized. But I think that the athletes have a lot of power. I think that especially with Mahomes, barring injury, I think the NFL is going to be willing to do a lot of different things than they would have otherwise because he's the face of the league, and someone that is Black and is politically, outspoken and unapologetically Black, I should say, right, and identifies as that they may actually change sort of how the NFL is structured, how it goes about operating. So that's all to say, and especially when you compare the NFL to the NBA. So I'm a big sports fan. I could talk all day about this. What I'm struck by is a league that does have an audience that's older and maybe more white, maybe more conservative, what have you, right? That you can still see the officers moving because they realize that like their power players, the players, right, that they can't really survive without, actually have these particular preferences, and I think that goes a long way. But I'm just really struck by like what's happened here with Kaepernick and how he was treated, and now all of a sudden the NFL seems to be pivoting away from that.
Can I ask? I'll follow up with the Kanye thing. I'll just say, what do the Republican operatives who are trying to put Kanye on the ballot, what do they not understand about Black Power? Or what do take that any way you want?
That's a great. That's such a good question. So what I'm struck by is, I remember College Dropout. All right, so I'm old enough that it came out, I think, in 2002, 2003. I was still in college. And I was just impressed. So here's this middle class like black guy that's talking about like his experiences, and I was really super impressed by what Kanye had to say. And I even bought a second album. I can't think of what it's called right now. And I was early in grad school. And so, he's since changed. He's aligned himself with Trump. And so, to answer your question, because I haven't answered your question yet, Max, is it almost assumes that black people will vote for someone just because they're black, right? And it kind of goes back to, I think it was Sam Jackson's question about Tim Scott. And so it's one of those things, folks, is I talked to you, throughout this talk about black political power. In the back of my mind, right, what I had in mind was partisanship as part of that, right? That it's going to be black Democrats who really going to be the ones that black people want to vote for, right, and so forth. There's a party element to this. So blacks aren't just going to vote for someone simply because they are of their group. I think about Herman Cain and his bids for the presidency and so forth. So that's all to say, I can't help but get the sense that people are thinking, okay, if I put Kanye on the ballot, maybe it'll take away from the black people or the young people who would otherwise vote for Joe Biden because Kanye is so popular and because he's black. And yeah, if that is the logic, what it fails to take into account is that Kanye is not seen as advocating for the interests of black people, and that a vote for people who understand anything about politics will realize that a vote for Kanye wouldn't actually help Joe Biden become the next president of the United States, or help someone other than Donald Trump, be inaugurated in January 2021.
Okay, thank
so
you.
I think let me say this. Again, I want to be. This is a public setting. This is video recorded, and I'm not able to have the back and forth. But what I'll say one more thing, and take it for what it is. I think what it points to, and this is something I say in my Southern politics class, and this is actually something that I'm deeply troubled by. Okay, to be honest, is that there's a failure to really understand the black community. Okay, one of the things that I think sometimes happens when people talk about black folks and black politics is, why are so many black people Democratic? Why are so few black people Republican? And what I tell people when they often ask me this, and you didn't ask me this, Max, but I have the floor, so just bear with me, is the reason why many black people are Democrats is because that's the party that was the least hostile to black interests, right? It's almost like what's the lesser of two evils, okay? If you go 60 years in the past or 70 years in the past, the Democrats, the white Southern Democrats, were the ones getting in the way of civil rights. So, and again, I'm not saying anything that no one else has said before. Okay, Haynes Walton, who I mentioned before, he's since passed. He's passed a number of years ago, but wrote so much as just a prolific black political scientist that wrote about black people, made this point about political parties. Okay, and others have made the point as well, which is this: in many ways, black people have looked for third parties. Okay, worked outside of the two-party system, because that system doesn't really necessarily work for black people. So I'll just say this to say that I think what that shows is that there's just a clear misunderstanding about the interests of black people, what makes black people tick, and I think in some ways it points to why the Republican Party, absent of Tim Scott, has such a difficult time gaining ground. Right? So Tim Scott is a black Republican, but why the party has such a difficult time gaining ground in the black community? Because if you think dangling Kanye West is going to I love this. I like this album in 2003. I'll vote for him. If that's the logic of black voters, it almost seems insulting. I'm just going to say that. I mean, okay.
I think you can say that fairly.
Yeah.
We have no more questions, so I would like to thank Chris Clark. You can hear the deafening applause, and I will just say a few more words to our people before we let you go, and then we'll bring you back to say goodbye to you one more time. Folks, thank you so much. I want to thank Professor Chris Clark. This is absolutely fascinating and important topic, and certainly if you have already signed up for this, you'll have access to this video. We would also like to invite anyone who is in a community college setting or a K through 12 setting. Professor Clark would be happy. We'd be happy to show this video, and Professor Clark would be happy to come back and lead a discussion with your students or your community. This is one of the benefits of us being able to do these types of recordings. I invite you all to come to humanities.unc.edu and see our upcoming programs. And a reminder, folks, to please check the times on our programs because of the shifting sands under our feet with things move. For example, our next Humanities in Action will be on September 1st, which I believe is a Tuesday and not a Wednesday, and at 3 o'clock as opposed to 3:30. So always check your schedule on those. Please go and look at our events. We have wonderful weekend seminars and, of course, all sorts of other special events and programs. programs. And of course, thank you for considering giving to Carolina Public Humanities as we get our online offerings and keep the connection between the University of North Carolina and all of the communities in North Carolina together through our work. So thank you again. Chris, come on up one more time and wave goodbye to everybody, and thank you for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, one more time, Chris Clark.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure. And yeah, you all take care. Stay safe, folks.